Final Fantasy VIII had one hell of a tough act to follow. Its predecessor was an instant hit and is widely regarded to this day. Square seems to have gone to the next logical step, double down on everything. Higher fidelity game models, better FMVs, a more complex story, and continuing to explore the more modern setting found in Final Fantasy VII. It all seemed to be in service of making use of what worked in the previous game. Can't say I blame Square for taking this approach though, it makes sense. And so Final Fantasy VIII was released in 1999 for the PS1. I think one of the things that strikes you on first playing this game, and is a massive improvement over Final Fantasy VII, is the massive leap in visual consistency and fidelity. No longer is there weird, chibi people in the towns, everyone's looking more realistically proportioned now. Final Fantasy VII's visuals were impressive, but have certainly dated more than Final Fantasy VIII's, evident from the intro to the game. 7's slow pan up from Aerith to show Midgar was awesome, and the music really sold the epic scale of it. However, I'd argue that the intro to 8 is way more impactful. It's very in your face, but Uematsu's iconic Liberi Fatale is so good, and the action is so well framed and choreographed, it blows 7 intros out the water in my opinion. It's also probably the bit of Final Fantasy VIII people remember the most, and with good reason to be honest. Let's quickly go over the version differences before moving forward. For this playthrough I played last year's Final Fantasy VIII Remastered. Honestly, I think this version is pretty decent out of the box. Yes, you do miss the analog movement from the PS1 version, but I think the updated character models look great compared to the previous PC version. Those old models were basically upscaled PS1 models, and they kinda look it frankly. The remastered models aren't radically different, just brushed up for the most part. Of course, the biggest complaint about the remaster is the lack of upscaled backgrounds, with the only touch up being a filter which causes them to look a little blurry. It looks a little jarring at first, granted, but you get used to it and it looks fine to me. The other flaw with presentation is the world map, which has really bad tiling. Something that's been inherited from the old PC version, unfortunately. It's unfortunate, but it's something I eventually learned to overlook and engage with as is. Of course, if you want the best looking game possible, there's a whole host of mods available for the old Steam version, including AI scaled backgrounds and analog movement. As I mentioned in the last video, I think the AI scaling is great, but it comes with its own faults when the AI can't interpret an image properly, although this happens very rarely. After playing the remastered version all the way, I think the AI scaling is the better option if you have the means and patience to do it. However, I feel the slightly blurry backgrounds are a good enough compromise to combat the pixelization if you don't feel like modding your game or are playing on console. All told, I think the remastered version is far and away the best package out of the box. The quality of life additions, mostly the 3x speed, are awesome to have and is the most readily available on all the modern consoles and PC. The PS1 version is a classic of course, but doesn't really blow up to a modern resolution smoothly. Graphically, Final Fantasy VIII is a much more impressive game than Final Fantasy VII. Square obviously got to grips with how to make use of the PlayStation hardware. The result is a more consistent art style, monsters in battle that are actually textured and not overly abstract, and really impressive FMV integrations to gameplay. They've really helped sell the grander set pieces to make them fun experiences. However, I feel this higher fidelity brought with it a lack of variety too. Yes, the monsters and summons look really impressive, a lot of work went into making them look cool and have fun animations. However, the roster of monsters you face is surprisingly lacking. In the end of the game, you're still fighting a few varieties of monster you've faced since the start. While Final Fantasy VII's monsters certainly looked low poly in places with a low amount of detail, it more than made up for it with unique designs and a massive variety. No such luck here. I also feel the increased infidelity in the backgrounds had an indirect impact on some of the dungeon design. For the most part they look really good, sporting a really appealing magical realism to the world. However, it's clear that some dungeons or set pieces require too much work and went with what they had. An optional dungeon, the Tomb of the Unknown King, has a gimmick where you can get lost in it and have to rely on a map to navigate it. It's supposed to be disorienting. However, I feel this more covers up the fact that the vast majority of the dungeon is only comprised of 3 tiles and that's it. I get that's kind of the point, but it didn't stop me from being bored by the visuals of what I was doing. This isn't the worst example of it though. The worst is the D prison, which you have to do in the story. It's 12 floors and literally every single one is copy-pasted screen. It's awful. What makes it worse is that you have to go up and down it several times, with the only clue on what floor you're on being the text as you enter the screen. I hated this bit of the game due to the repetitiveness of it. For all my moaning though, I still think the visuals are easily Final Fantasy VIII's strongest feature, showcasing beautifully an imaginative world with greatly realised action sequences. Gameplay is, at a bare bones basic level, unchanged from Final Fantasy VII, We still have the same ATB system for battles, and navigating is basically the same, although there's no little hand helping to show the exits and ladders this time around. With Squall specifically too, you can force critical hits by pressing the right bumper or R1 as he strikes, both adding a small amount of action-focused gameplay to battles, and making Squall the most overpowered melee fighter in the game. Outside of that, gameplay is radically different though. Leveling up doesn't have the same benefits you would normally expect. Every level needs exactly 1000 experience points first of all, and secondly, the enemies of the world scale to your level. This, in theory, reduces the amount of grinding you have to do. In practice, it's kinda true. My levels at the end of the game were relatively low. Squall was at level 30 something, and the other two were around the mid-20s. However, the grind doesn't come in the form of killing monsters for EXP, it comes from finding and drawing magic. This is linked to the junction system, which is used to determine stats. The summons of this game are called Guardian Forces or GFs. Don't worry, I'm pretty sure I've heard all the jokes regarding this acronym. When you junction a GF to a character, you can start slotting magic into various stats depending on which GF is equipped. So, magic is directly linked to increasing your stats, and magic can be acquired by either drawing it from enemies or draw points in the world, or refining it with other GF skills from various items and cards. Refining isn't properly explained by the game, by the way. I had to discover this myself after spending ages drawing from enemies. Either way involves grinding for various draw points, drops from enemies, directly from enemies, or from playing a whole load of card games. Triple Triad, the card game, is a popular minigame. However, I personally don't really care for it. I don't in any game like this. I can't stand in-universe card games. Not here, not in Final Fantasy IX, nor in The Witcher 3. I'm personally just not interested. So with magic being linked to your stats, you've got a bad situation on your hands with battles. You want the most powerful magic as it gives you the biggest stat boosts. However, you also don't want to use that magic because using it will reduce your stats. It's pretty much a catch-22. For example, I gave my magic focused character a bunch of high-end spells like Meteor and Flare, and most importantly, Ultima. Ultima is a literal nuke, but I never used it because I junctioned it to the magic stat instead, as it gave so much. It turned out I never needed it to beat the game, but a massive awesome spell went basically unused for me due to the way the systems work. My biggest gripe outside of the junction system is the fact that if you really want to dish out big damage without spending your precious magic, you need to spam summons. And boy oh boy did they double down on the summons in this game over Final Fantasy VII. All the summons look awesome, their animations are flashy and don't cost anything to use in battle. They start their own cast bar as you summon them and take damage in place of the character using them, hence Guardian Force. However, not only do some animations take a while to complete, the amount of times you use them makes the spectacle fall very quickly. I truly got sick of seeing the Shiva and Quetzalcoatl animations by the end of the game, and I am extremely glad the remastered version of the game has a 3x speed feature, because the tedium would be almost unbearable otherwise. The last thing I'll say with regards to gameplay is that I hate the way that weapons have to be crafted for each character. You don't find any new weapons in the world. I could only bring myself to get one of Squall's mid-tier weapons, but even that was too much for me. Having to rely on rare monster drops or triple triad cards which I had to Google to know where to find, it wasn't a great feeling to be honest. The story of Final Fantasy VIII is a bit of a weird one. It's pretty convoluted, even more so in a way that Final Fantasy VII wasn't. The premise is that Squall and the other main characters are students at Garden, a mercenary military school kind of setup. It's probably the most anime of the story so far, not only due to the school-like setting, but also with how the team is on average about 17 years old. The story starts out with the aftermath of an intense rivalry during training between Squall and Cypher, the pair giving each other their iconic facial scars. A part I like about the storytelling in this game is that Squall has been given a consistent inner monologue, so we know what's going through his mind in a lot of places. Although a lot of what goes through his head is honestly a lot of brooding. This isn't just the dismissive and infamous whatever lines either. A lot of his inner monologue is pretty broody, no one understands me kind of stuff. This characterization bleeds into some of the other characters too, in that they're written in a pretty realistic fashion as teenagers. This is one hell of a double-edged sword, as on one hand it's kinda cool that the characters in a story like this are acting realistically for their age, but on the other hand it also makes it hard to truly invest in them as characters with some of the things they say or do, and some of that is truly dumb and kinda confounding. Mystery begins pretty early when a mysterious girl seems to recognise Squall despite him seemingly not sharing that familiarity. His instructor in class is Quistis, who is 18 years old, dresses vaguely like a librarian, and uses a whip. Okay Nomura, I see what you're about. After a short introductory dungeon used to demonstrate various gameplay basics regarding junctioning, The intro shifts gear into a military operation to defend the port of Dolet from an invasion by the Galbadian army. Or the G army, as all the kids are literally saying. This is their exam to be a member of the elite mercenary unit, by the way, known as Seed. I'm not exactly sure what the plant theming has to do with anything, but it's a neat naming policy. This is where most of the rest of the cast is introduced to. Zell is an energetic melee brawler who is so energetic he just can't sit still, and he really likes hot dogs. Selphie is a transfer student from another garden, and she's pretty much a typical anime teen girl in her mannerisms. She's quirky and expressive. The other characters that round out the roster come in later in the story. Renoa is the leader of a ragtag group of resistance fighters in Timber, who hires Seed in order to help with their mission. And Irvine, who is from another garden and is a sharpshooter and ladies' man. You can tell from his cool hat and sick trench coat. The story in general follows the group on their mission assigned by their garden to assist Renoa in a fight against the Galbadian army to liberate her town. Although it all escalates from there, involving powerful sorceresses, a magical plot that involves ending in the world, a romance subplot that takes the spotlight for a surprising amount of time, and a mystery regarding a second set of characters that Squall and Buddies keep dreaming about. What links the characters of this dream to Squall and their mission? What nefarious plot does the sorceress have up her lengthy sleeve? What's the deal with the Galbadian army? What's their endgame? Find out by either playing the game or sticking around for the spoilers. My spoiler-free thoughts on the story though are that I think the ending is interesting and reframes the story in a unique way. I felt the story of Final Fantasy VIII is overall a good one, although the character development for the supporting cast is rather weak, and I couldn't connect with a lot of the characters either due to them being a bit dumb, or they were just bland. Playing through the story is enjoyable for its mysteries and awesome set pieces though, even if some of the revelations may leave you wanting. Spoilers are inbound now. They will end at the timestamp currently on the screen. Jump to it to avoid them. They'll start in 3, 2, 1. So I guess I'll handle the spoilers topic by topic. I'll start with the plot point that starts the whole journey off in earnest, helping Renoa liberate Timber. It's really cool how there's an elaborate plan to swap out the train cars with the president of Dayling, the capital of Galbadia, but the explanation goes on longer than the actual mission. The long briefing helps fit in with the military operation theming the story has, but as far as pacing goes, it feels like a bit of a slog to be honest. And the cherry on top, after everything is said and done, I don't think Timber is liberated at all by the end. This whole subplot is pretty much dropped as soon as sorceresses are introduced as the ultimate evil to defeat. Even Renoa seems to forget all about it. Throughout the game, the main characters lose consciousness and dream of another set of characters, Laguna and his friends. It's sort of a parallel story that involves a romance subplot in a similar sort of fashion to the main story. Laguna is pretty much the opposite of Squall. He's a bit of a goofball and he can talk for ages about anything at all. The dreams turn out to be of 17 years or more prior and affect Squall and company as a side effect of the mysterious girl Alon looking back in the past to see if she could use her powers to change the past, not just observe it. She's unsuccessful at this aim, unable to change the past to prevent her own kidnapping. She does learn how much Laguna loves her by experiencing his point of view though. She's the main motivation for a lot of what he did in the past. He doted for an attractive singer in Dolet named Julia when he used to be a part of the Galbadian army, but despite getting along, they couldn't be together. Laguna eventually finds refuge in a town and semi-retires in the company of Alon and her adopted mother Rain, who he becomes very fond of. The rest of the flashbacks are misadventures of him out in the world, trying to make it in various other professions, and even gets involved in a prison break. All in the interest of keeping Alon out of the hands of people who would use her powers for ill. Laguna is very likeable, and his subplot is engaging, if a little silly in places. But the silliness adds to the levity the sections you play as Laguna and Cobra. His warm-hearted nature is easy to get swept up in, and his connection to Squall with the dreams has a nice air of mystery about it. And then you finally meet him in the present day. He ends up as president of Esthar, and his friends are there helping him too. I think this is a really disappointing end for his character arc. I was hoping he would help in a more direct way and have a good chance to play off Squall. Unfortunately, he's all but written out of the story. I do like that it's not explicitly said, but heavily implied that he is Squall's father. Rain had a child while he was away, and he never got to go back for her. Something he regrets heavily. That child is put in an orphanage, and the rest is history. It's interesting to note that Renoa is Julia's daughter, so it means that while Laguna and Julia couldn't be together, the children could a generation later. That's pretty poetic. Renoa and Squall are pretty much the focus in terms of characters. They're even right there in the logo. The idea is that their romance takes the centre stage. She is a foil to him in that she's personality-wise pretty different from Squall. She helps him try to express his feelings more as she gets pretty in tune with the way of his thinking. and she kind of breaks through a bit. However, at the end of Disc 2, she becomes almost dead and this snaps Squall. He becomes more outwardly emotional, even if that emotion turns out to be mostly sadness and anger. Through a series of misadventures to try and revive her, it's revealed that Rinoa is a sorceress, and so becomes a part of the plan to take down the big bad. Honestly, her and Squall's subplot is really nice in places. The scene in space is a standout moment. I even got a little invested in their romance by the end. While I wasn't so sure on them at the start of the game, the characters do go through development. Squall is taken out of his introvert state of mind, and Rinoa becomes less overly naive. This is all due to what they go through throughout the story, which I can't say a lot for the rest of the characters. The big bad in this game is a sorceress named Ultimecia, a sorceress from the future who wishes to destroy the world through time compression. What's time compression? It's compressing the whole of the universe into one moment, and she plans to be in the middle of it to absorb all its power. The power she'd attain would allow her to be a god essentially, existing in a world only she could exist. And it honestly doesn't get much deeper than that, apart from that she went to the Mortal Kombat School of Spelling. She's present technically throughout a lot of the story, with her possessing of both Edea and Rinoa to help her towards her goals. And as Edea takes over the Galbadian army by having herself become the ambassador of Daling, then promptly killing the president to take over his seat of power. She gives this extremely evil speech to the people of Daling to the crowd's delight. Even the executing of President Daling is met with applause. It's not obvious in the game, but the crowd seems to be under Ultimecia's spell. Comparing her to previous games' antagonists though, she is nowhere near on the same caliber as Sephiroth or Kefka, or even Exdeath. At least he was fun and present in person for more of the plot. The rest of the characters are honestly pretty forgettable, which is ironic given the ending and how they traverse the time compression. The character descriptions I gave earlier for Zell and Selphie are pretty much their only traits throughout the game. Selphie likes trains, and even when her old garden gets blown up, she doesn't really show much about it, instead staying her usual upbeat self. There's barely any exploration of any of the characters outside of Squall and Rinoa. There is a point early on where Quistis reflects on why she didn't turn out to be a good leader, but that story beat is dropped about as quickly as it comes up. And speaking of Quistis, I think she's responsible for the biggest waste of time in the story. When waiting for her role to come about in the attempted assassination of Edea, she had previously told Rinoa some hard truths, and now she feels bad about it, in the middle of the mission, and so leads the other two with her back to the mansion to apologise, only to get locked in and have to explore a copy-paste sewer dungeon to get back, taking almost an hour of game time. And the thing is, they get back in time to succeed in their part of the mission, so the whole ordeal was pointless, completely, only being used to run out the runtime for some reason. The only other character to impact the story in any way really is Irvine, because he remembers the gang all being together in Edea's orphanage when they were kids. This is due to him not using GFs until recently, and explains why he can't take the shot at Edea, as he recognises her as their matron. This is one of the big twists the story does, and is explained by the GF memory loss, but it doesn't stop it from coming across as really contrived. A big point in the plot is the Lunar Cry, which is dragging monsters from the moon to the earth due to this ancient crystal known as Lunatic Pandora calling them down. However, it barely feels impactful. Nothing changes outside of Lunatic Pandora moving in place to collect the Sorceress Adele. There's monsters in Esthar City now, but outside of that there's no real feeling that this cataclysmic event has even occurred. This is one of the elements of the plot that I felt got implemented a bit sloppily. I think it would have been fine to have it just bring down Adele without the added monster element, if it wasn't going to affect the plot too much. The ending is interesting though. After defeating Ultimecia, time decompresses. Everyone needs to focus on a place and people that they have strong emotional bonds to in order to end up at the right time. Everyone succeeds except Squall, who in his confused state of mind ends up at the orphanage, but when he's still a kid, and meets Edea of 15 or so years ago. He inadvertently tells her about Seed and their goals, which is when a dying Ultimecia shows up and passes on her powers to Edea. This creates a closed time loop in which Ultimecia and Squall have determined this outcome forever. Squall gets lost in time again after this though, as he tries to make his way back, starting to forget all his memories as he tries to focus on them, represented in the cutscene by all the clips of Rinoa getting more and more distorted. Eventually he collapses as he imagines another timeline where Rinoa dies in space. She eventually figures out he needs help, and through magic represented by a white feather, she finds him in the void. This is cool in that it loops back into the intro with Rinoa in the field, and turning a petal into a feather, tying into the time concept. I like this ending. It ties together some of the smaller plot points in a nice way, and the elegance the time loop has is pretty commendable, to be honest. I just wish the characters outside of Squall, Rinoa and Laguna were better though. Welcome back to anyone who skipped ahead. Let's talk about some music. Final Fantasy VIII's music is probably the most defining feature of it. It's evident as soon as you start a new game that the quality of the music is a lot higher than even Final Fantasy VII. We got vocals now. While I don't think all the melodies in the songs of 8 are quite as good as 7's, Uematsu did some astonishing work with the soundtrack here. Highlights for me include Martial Law, Landing, Force Your Way, Fisherman's Horizon, The Man with the Machine Gun, Blue Fields, and The Extreme. Can't fault the music at all really, it's simply excellent. So in conclusion, I think Final Fantasy VIII is a great game, if a heavily flawed one. The gameplay is bogged down heavily by the junction system and the slow-paced battles it encourages. The story is compelling, but with the majority of the cast functionally non-existent for the majority of the game. While it's not totally important for every character in an ensemble to have a deep character explorations, I feel they need to have at least some sort of impact on the story. The characters outside of Squall and Rinoa failed to do this in my opinion, and just seem along for the ride for the most part. For example, while I didn't find all the characters of Final Fantasy VII to be all that deep, There were small subplots with most of them, and they had a compelling reason to carry on fighting for the planet. I'm not sure I could say the same for Final Fantasy VIII's crew. What's Zell's motivation to carry on fighting? Selfies? Outside of being paid by Seed anyway, I suppose, although that motivation never comes up for anyone. I suppose they're doing it because of the power of friendship or something, but it's just not as engaging as what's come before in the past 2 games. However, while the themes of the story didn't really click with me, I can completely understand why it may resonate with others, especially if this was their first game in the series and they were about the ages the characters are here. So my current rankings for the game so far are as follows: 1 Final Fantasy 6, 2 Final Fantasy 7, 3 Final Fantasy 5, 4 Final Fantasy 8, 5 Final Fantasy 4, 6 Final Fantasy 1, 7 Final Fantasy 3, and 8 Final Fantasy 2. I place it below 5 because I think the gameplay there is stellar, and above 4 because I feel the replay value is way better in 8. This is mostly due to how much the 4's story is ruined by replaying it, whereas 8 is enhanced in subsequent playthroughs. So that's it, thanks for watching. Next time I'll be taking a look at Final Fantasy 9, which I've honestly been looking forward to. So subscribe, like, comment, all the usual stuff in the meantime, I appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.